A good drum recording is a good drummer in phase. Done.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here today with my Canadian co-host, mastering engineer and musician, Malcolm Owen Flood. Hey Malcolm, how are you doing today?
Hello. Greetings from cold Canada.
Is it cold? Is it
it's
as cold
as
people think it is?
No, I'm on Vancouver Island, which is like as south as you can get in Canada. It's totally fine. But I just got back from Trinidad, which was tropical and beautiful.
Okay.
So it's cold for me.
Okay, because like Canada to me is cold by default. I can't imagine Canada not being cold.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but I have this picture in my head that Canada, like, I don't know. You actually have a summer there?
Yes, yeah. We have like a pretty long summer. It's pretty nice here, man. We're lucky on the island. People surf here and stuff. It's great.
Really?
Yeah. Dude, I got to show you something. The podcast people can't see it, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but check out my suntan on my foot.
That's super cool.
I got the sandal tan. Can you see it?
Shit, yeah.
I burnt my feet so bad. It's wretched, but...
In Trinidad? Or
in Trinidad, yeah. Not in Canada, that's for sure.
Yeah. Not in Canada in February. Yeah. So, what were you doing in Trinidad?
I was working on the Netflix doc, and we were recording steel pan bands. I don't know if you've ever seen like steel drums.
Yeah.
But they have there was like a 40-piece kind of orchestra of steel pan drums there. They have like a bass section and altos and the whole thing. It sounds like the what it reminded me of is like a Hans Zimmer like film score. It's like this huge, like really epic. Oh, it's so wild and incredibly loud.
Awesome. And incredibly loud?
Oh, yeah. Just like mind-bogglingly loud. Imagine 40 drummers playing different notes. And there's a drum kit in the band.
Oh, wow. Like I actually had a similar experience last week because we celebrated our 5-year-old daughter's birthday at the studio, and I gave them drumsticks and like set up the drums and amps and guitars and everything. And what you just described sounds like what I heard all day when we celebrated the birthday, because there were like 6 kids hitting all sorts of drums and cymbals and guitars and everything at the same time for 4 hours, which was wild. So yeah, and also super loud.
Yeah. That's like the perfect segue into the conversation we're going into.
Oh yeah, it actually is.
Drum phase, isn't it?
Yeah, today we're talking about a thing called phase, and specifically drum phase. Before we get into that, I would like to ask you, Malk, if you as an engineer, mastering engineer or mixing engineer, if you hear a song that has phase issues with the drums, what is it that you hear that makes you immediately think there's something wrong with the drum phase here? There's some mistake happened. What is it? What are you hearing?
Okay, so from an instrument level, it's normally the snare, right? Like if there's a piece of the drum kit that I can hear it on pretty much instantly, it's the snare, or sometimes kind of just like the cymbals. But what the actual like effect that I'm hearing, the result that is like phasey, is this kind of like thin, smeared out kind of like no punch drum sound. Does that sound right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, would you agree on that? Is that kind of the culprits that you find?
Absolutely. I think there's 2 main things. The one is this lack of punch and like a thin sounding snare with no body, kind of. That's the one thing, and that sometimes happens if people forget to like invert the polarity on one of the snare mics if they used to, or if the snare is out of phase with the overheads. That's the other thing that can happen.
Yes.
And same with the toms and 2 kick drum mics and all sorts of that sort of stuff. And the other thing that I hear immediately is like comb filtering, is it called? In the high end, like when Like, for example, if you record a drum set in a room with a very low ceiling and no acoustic treatment, above the cymbals, and then the reflections from the ceiling arrive almost at the same time at the microphones as the cymbals themselves. Then they create some weird, phasey, like almost like chorusy sounding sounds.
Yep.
Like almost like what the thing you hear when you listen to a bad MP3, that kind of sound, kind of.
Yeah, I think
That's
that's
also
like
the thing that I hear.
the smear I'm talking about is that comb filtering, where it's just like missing the information you're wanting.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's a that giveaway. Like it's something you hear immediately, and it completely ruins like the drum sound. So that's why we're talking about it, because it's so important. And
Yep.
there's not much you can do with like tools like EQ and compression and all other stuff if the phase is just messed up. Like
Yeah, you have to get it right while you're recording. Absolutely.
yeah,
All right. I think for people listening in, it's the first thing to understand is maybe actually starting with polarity even. So polarity and phase are different things, but we're going to be talking about them in a very related way, and they're very correlated. So phase, I think, or polarity, sorry, is easier to understand. If you picture a waveform, like if you've done any recording at all, you've seen a waveform, and there's parts of the waveform that go up, and there's parts that go down, and normally there's like a line in the middle, so you can kind of see what's above the line and what's below the line. Above the line is what we call positive, and below the line would be negative. And your speakers read this information as positive is when they are pushing out, and when it is negative, they are pulling in. So you've probably seen speakers move. They just move forward and backwards. And it is the phase that is deciding, sort of the polarity of the signal that is deciding the movement of that speaker. So now let's look at that in a musical way, and in the most common kind of polarity situation, I guess. And that for me, that's the snare mic. That's the one I learned on. So I'm going to stick with that. Often you'll throw a top mic and a bottom mic on a snare. So they are miking the same source, but the mics are facing in opposite directions. And what ends up happening is you end up getting a positive phase version of the snare in one microphone and a negative polarity version in the other microphone. Excuse me for swapping phase and polarity every second sentence here. Like we said, just kind of assume they're the same thing for now. Like it's just easier to understand that way, and then you'll make sense of it later. So you get positive into one, negative into another, because you're recording the top and the bottom of the same source. Now, what happens if you kind of looked at those waveforms, one's going up and one's going down, but otherwise they're identical pretty well, and you put them over top of each other, they cancel out, right? Because it's like they're the opposite of each other. So what that causes is phase cancellation. And in theory, if you had like a perfectly flipped phase situation like that, the snare signal would entirely disappear. And what that means in a drum recording is that if you have bad polarity and phase relationships, is you start losing frequencies or even entire drums from your drum kit. And it makes it really hard. It makes it impossible to have a good drum mix. And it is probably the most common DIY pitfall that I've ever encountered. I don't know about you, Benny, but like there's more times than not where bands go wrong recording themselves. Is the drum
absolutely,
recording.
and the reason for it is often phase or polarity. And like a way you could think of it is when the two microphones are facing each other, so one looks up and one looks down, like as Max described with the snare mics, like what happens is like sound is basically moving air. And if one mic has air pressure coming to the mic and pushing the membrane, like the diaphragm of the mic, into the mic, and the other mic, the other capsule gets pulled out because air is moving away from it at the same time, then you're essentially telling that gets recorded, and the speaker is just the mic in reverse. So you're basically telling the speaker to move out and pull back at the same time. So the speaker essentially does nothing, and that means it's silence. So you're telling the speaker to do opposite things. And that happens because the microphones look at each other. They face each other, look in different directions. And Yeah,
That's an awesome explanation.
Thank you. And that's basically what happens. And that concept of a speaker being a mic in reverse is pretty good to know and always to remember, because that's exactly what that is. A dynamic microphone is basically the same principle as a speaker. We don't add into the technical details here, but it's enough that you know that both of those things move in and out, and the one records it, the other plays it back, but it's the same thing. And if you tell the thing to do both at once, move out and pull back in, then it results in silence. And that's the most obvious version of it, like if it's total or almost complete cancellation. But there's another thing, and that is it doesn't have to be the same sound or almost the same sound at the same time that has just the polarity inverted, which is the case with the snare mics. But it can also happen, as Malcolm described, like if sound arrives at different times at the same microphone. So if you have an overhead and toms, and the same source, like one drum makes a sound, and then the sound arrives at one mic very early, and then at the overheads later, then it might be actually the same polarity because both mics look at the drum, but in the overhead it just arrives later, and then it might arrive at a time where there's a negative and at the same time a positive on the direct close mic. And in that case, you can either move the mic around until you find a spot where it works and it adds instead of canceling out, or you can try and flip the polarity and see if that does the trick. Or if like you just can't get it wrong during recording, then the only thing you can do is try and fix it afterwards by like delaying a mic or flipping the phase afterwards, which can help, but it's always a really good practice to try and put the mics in positions where they just work without any post-production editing and stuff.
Absolutely. One thing for people that are just like, what the hell are these guys talking about? Look at your interface right now, and there is going to be a little button that is like a circle with a diagonal line through it. That is the phase or the polarity button. So when we say flipping the phase or flipping the polarity, that is the button you're going to click. Whenever you've got two mics or more than one mic on a single source, you're going to want to click that button.
Exactly. And if you don't have the button, which could be the case with some especially cheaper interfaces.
Yep.
I have one in front of me, a little interface that I use for mobile recordings that doesn't have a phase button, a polarity button. If that's the case, then there's no other way than flipping the polarity inside your software, inside the DAW, which is totally fine. It's the same thing. Yep. Just don't forget to do it. And when in doubt, I would always try that actually, or not only when in doubt, I would just try it on like default. Yep. Like whenever I record a source with more than one microphone, I just try both positions and see which sounds better.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because sometimes it's obvious. I mean, with the two snare mics, if you've heard what we're talking about once, you will always know what we're talking about, and you will hear it immediately if it's out of phase. But with things like overheads to snares, it can be tricky. It might not be as obvious. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it might be a subtle difference, and you might think everything's totally fine until you hit that button and then realize, wow, there's my punch. So always try that, like always, and see what works, what works better. And if you're not satisfied with any of the positions of the polarity switch, then I would go in and just move the mic around, move the overhead a couple inches back or closer, maybe like change the angle a bit, or like just play around with mic positionings until you feel like there's maximum pressure and punch there.
Yeah.
And that goes for all multi-mic sources. Like same, and the more low end a signal has, the more obvious that is. Yes. It's very hard to hear in the beginning with like the cymbal sound or maybe the crack of the snare drum and stuff like that, but it's super easy to hear with the body of the snare drum or an instrument like a kick drum.
Yep.
If you have two kick drum mics and they are then the two polarity positions are completely different. The tricky thing here is though that it might not be totally obvious which one is better when you try that. in the first time with the kick drum at least, but with the snare drum immediately you'll find that one position has no punch and the other has.
Yes.
But with a kick drum, this is a little tricky because the lower an instrument sounds, the lower the lower the frequencies you record, the longer the waves are, like that moving air that I described, or the waveform. And if you have a very long waveform and two of them, and you invert the polarity of one of them, then if they're not completely accurate on top of each other, then there are always slight, like they're always like in certain positions, there are little cancellations, and then they add, and then they cancel out again, and like it's almost impossible to get the whole thing like completely in sync. And so when you flip it, some parts of it will add, and others will cancel out. So you might end up in one position with a very deep, very subby kick drum that has not much like punch or knock to it. And if you flip it, you might get a higher sounding kick drum with more of the audible like punch, like a chip, like as if you would like shifted the fundamental up a bit, and with less sub bass. And you might find one or the other better for the song. So, and one might be more in phase and one might be more out of phase. And it might be difficult to figure out at first which one is better or which one is right. Sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes this can even be a creative decision. Sometimes you can use phase or polarity as an EQ, because if they cancel out completely, it's obvious. But as I said, if there are like time differences and they don't cancel out completely, then both of them are not 100% right and not 100% wrong. And they just sound different, and you have to figure out what's right for what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And it's important. Like normally a really solid phase relationship is the goal, but in like it's not always the case. Like take room mics, for example, on a drum kit. They're, it's 6 feet, 12 feet away from the drum. They're never going to be in phase, right? Like they're never going to line up with your close mics unless you go and move them in post. But like that kind of defeats the purpose of this kind of delayed sound that you're going for. That's not to say that you shouldn't check the phase on your room mics. I still believe in doing that because it will sound different, but it's not the same type of thing that we're talking about where like the snare is going to disappear from your mix kind of thing, right? With the two snare mics. So always strive for the best phase relationship you can get, but then also know that the delay is a natural part of recording a drum kit. Your overheads are never going to be as close as your snare bottom is to your snare, right? They're just further away. It's how it works.
Absolutely.
Now, for me, I wonder what you think on this, Benny. But if I don't get a noticeable change, like if I flip the overheads and I'm like, like going back and forth, and it's not like a pretty noticeable change, I consider myself two in the middle kind of thing. Like I'm not I'm like what you talked about. I'm kind of in between phase. So the polarity isn't really lining up, and I consider that that's an instant. Like I got to move it. I want to be able to know like that's good, that's bad.
Yes.
So I almost always shift it again until it is a noticeable change, because then I know that I'm more on that like 180 axis. If that makes sense. So
absolutely, with the overheads, totally. Yeah, because as you said, if nothing happens really, then that just means it's not.
It's wrong
in phase, and it's not. And it's not canceling out. Something in between, but at least you know that you're not getting maximum punch, maximum pressure, and so that's definitely a sign to move one of the mics.
Totally, especially on close mics. Like so, if you have a snare top and bottom, and your snare sound doesn't self-destruct when you flip or don't flip the phase kind of thing. So then you know you've got really bad placement going on. It should, like if you've got it wrong, the snare should sound like it's disappearing on you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or if you got it right.
But I don't know if I would always agree with that with a kick drum. Depends on how it's mic'd. If you have two microphones exactly next to each other, then absolutely, then 100%. They should either add or almost completely cancel out each other. And so if that's the case, maybe you have two mics on the resonant head, you should definitely hear a drastic difference if you flip the polarity. But if you have one mic like in the middle of the kick drum inside and one a couple of inches away from the resonant head, then that might be a different thing because, first of all, they don't have this super direct phase relationship. They are not like, they sound very different and like on themselves. And also, that's where it starts to get, you can start to get creative and combine those two to create a sound. And sometimes this delay and the mixture of those two signals, even with all the cancellations, can result in the drum tone that you want. So with kick drums, as I said, sometimes it's funny because sometimes I think I got it right and then I flip it and then that doesn't sound too bad. And then I'm not sure. And then, I mean, they are different, but it's not that one is completely wrong or the other is completely wrong. And that might be okay. That might not mean that I positioned them wrong. But absolutely with the overheads, I think totally. And also, of course, with two mics on the same source next to each other or like top and bottom with the same distance from the heads, that should totally cancel out. But every time when there's a delay involved, it's almost always like a matter of taste and the creative decision. But I think that's something you just have to try and hear a couple of times and flip back and forth and see what it does. And then you'll figure it out pretty quickly. I think it's the most important thing is to know that this is even a thing and to experiment with that. From the moment that I learned about this, it didn't take long to for me to get the concept and then get experimenting and finding out what it does.
Yeah, it's a complicated concept, but it's really easy to put into practice.
Yes.
And we could break that down for somebody that hasn't done this and they're like, okay, well, how do we do it? Here it is. You've mic'd up a drum kit. Let's say we've got like the most basic drum kit recording going on. We've got a kick, snare, top and bottom, two toms with close mics on them, and a set of overheads. For me, I would start with checking that snare top and bottom. And then, so you know what, before I even did it, like, guys, if you just do this, you'll be 90% right most of the time. If you have that miking setup I just said, flip the bottom snare, flip your overheads, you're probably good.
Yeah.
Right? So the snare top and bottom that bottom one's almost always going to need to be flipped, and your overheads are almost always going to need to be flipped. And you should still check them. Sometimes it just doesn't seem that way. And for whatever reason, at least overheads. But if you start with that as your default, you'll probably get it right. And then what you do from there, that's like my default starting point. But then I still double check them. And then I go around and check the rest of the pieces with the overhead. So I check my toms against the overheads. Check your kick against the overhead. If you have any more mics, like if you have a ride spot mic, I check the snare against that as well. And then if it was out, I would flip the ride as well. Hi-hat, I check everything against my snare by the end of it.
Sure.
You do the same thing?
Sometimes I do the opposite and I flip the snare top and leave the bottom and overheads as they are. And that's, I'll talk about that later in this episode, why I do that. Okay. But cool. Basically I do the same thing as you do. And I think it's generally a good practice to, when you sound check, not only to listen to the shells, to the close mics and solo, but just leave the overheads on. I mean, of course, every now and again, hit the solo button, listen to what the close mic sounds on its own, but always, as Malcolm said, always check the close mics with the overheads, just for that reason, with the phase, the polarity. And that's basically what I do. And I would agree that the snare is probably the most important piece of the whole kit, so I'll start with that. And I mean, the mic is pretty close. There's not much you can move or do because that will drastically change the sound of the snare drum mic. So you probably want to find a position that sounds perfect for the snare and then don't touch it again. So that's why I think you say you would rather move or flip the overheads and the snare bottom. And I would do the same. I would start with the snare, get it sounding good, and then would try and move the overheads around and then the toms to the overheads and stuff like that.
One more hack would be just if not everybody has this on their interface, but it's probably an option in your DAW. But if you're struggling to hear what we're talking about and tell if you can tell a phase is shifting in a good way or bad way, I find it a lot easier in mono. And I don't even know why that is. But I click mono, and the change becomes much more apparent. I think it's because all the low end information is kind of more focused, and I can hear that shift better. But try that out if you're having trouble hearing it.
Sure. I think it's partly because of the low end, and I think that out of phase stuff that has a little stereo information can be still perceived with punch, because like depends on how your room is set up, and like it's tricky because there's a delay between the speakers and it might actually cancel out, but because of the delay you might hear it with the bottom end. So yeah, absolutely try and listen in mono. That's the safe bet. And one more thing to say about the drum setup, like if you do what Malcolm said, you're probably 90% there. But there's one thing that's also pretty important, and that is the surrounding surfaces around your drum kit. That goes a little into the room acoustics thing, but it's important here because phase and polarity always matter whenever you try to combine two similar sounds and try to add them together. That can be two recordings with two microphones of the same source, but that can also be a source recorded with a microphone and like a reflection or mirror of that source hitting the microphone almost at the same time. Because then you're not adding it afterwards, but it gets added in the air and then the microphone picks it up. And that's what happens when you have like blank, untreated walls around your drum kit and you hit the snare. Then your microphone hears the direct sound from the snare drum. And like if there's a wall like a couple of feet directly next to the kit, then there will be a super loud reflection from that wall coming back into the microphone, and that reflection will be there almost at the same time as the direct sound. So it's early enough that our brain cannot like tell that it's a reflection. It just mixes it with the direct sound, and those two will cancel out, and they will add some frequencies will add, some will cancel out. Same thing that we talked about with two microphones recording the same source. So you might want, or you definitely want to get rid of those early reflections around your drum kit. That doesn't mean you have to like deaden the whole room, because reflections from further away, if they are late enough at the microphone, then our brain actually perceives them as room sound, as reflections, as delay, whatever. And you can decide for yourself if you like that sound or not, but it's definitely a reflection and a room sound. And it's not just a weird snare sound. But if those reflections are there very, very early, then they get mixed with the direct sound and they alter your snare tone. And that can sound really weird. That can like smear the punch, the transient. And it can sound like a weird MP3 when you're talking about cymbals, because as I said at the beginning of this episode, when you have an untreated ceiling above your cymbals and the reflections arrive at the microphone and they're arriving from the back, so they like that's already a kind of weird situation, because the microphone gets some information from the front and then some from the back that got reflected by the wall, and it all mixes into this weird high-end cymbal thing. Then it actually can sound like as if you put a chorus effect or a phaser or whatever on the overhead mics, and it can sound really weird, like a bad MP3, and it can lack clarity. It can mess up your stereo image. It just sounds weird, and if you don't know what the reason is for this, it can be frustrating because it just sounds weird, and you don't know why that is, and you're just wondering why your overheads sound cheap and crappy.
Yeah, it sounds cheap. That's the perfect word.
The moment you put a cloud up there, meaning some sort of absorber above the cymbals, or you have a really high ceiling, that's also good. The moment you record something like that, it immediately becomes clear what I'm talking about, because it immediately sounds much more even, less nasty resonances, less of the chirping MP3 kind of birds in space sound, and less a better stereo image, more clarity, expensive like top end, and also the cymbals. The nice like side effect of that is the cymbals will become more controlled, and the bleed and the close mics will be better and not as loud, and it just will be better and much more transparent. So absorber stuff, absorptive material around your drum kit and on the ceiling, helps. And it also got to do with phase, with polarity and phase. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll
Yeah.
end up doing an entire episode.
I think
on
so. I think so. Yeah.
Stuff. But yeah, it definitely does play into phase. Without
So
a doubt.
basically, it's every time, as I said, every time you add two sounds, two sources together, you're gonna have to deal with that, and you're gonna have to think about phase and polarity. It can be two microphones recording the same source, or it can be two sources in a room that hit the microphone and they are similar. I think the thing that's important here is it has to be similar. Like if there's no phase relationship because it's totally different sounds, then it's not a problem. But if it's a similar sound, then you have that problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a neat thing. For example,
Yes.
in my and you can try that as well. Just a little trick here, if you have the possibility to do that. Like in my recording room, it's a pretty small room, and I don't get like a big room sound out of the room itself. But I have a chamber next to the room that is like storage room, and it's empty, untreated, pretty high ceiling, and it's super live, super long decay. So, and when I record drums, I leave the door open and put microphones out there. And it's like around the corner. So these room mics in the chamber next to the recording room, they don't see the drum kit. And there's a pretty long delay until like the sound from the drum kit arrives at those room mics. And the result is that there's basically no direct phase relationship between the drum kit and those room mics. And that's pretty cool because that's a case where I can put them wherever I want in that chamber and hit the polarity switch, and it doesn't really change anything because it's too less of a relation. There's not enough of a relationship between those and the drum kit. But if those microphones were a couple of feet in front of the drum kit, looking at the drum kit, then you would have a relationship, and then you would have a difference if you flip polarity.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, that like distance is the mojo. It is the purpose of those. So don't freak out when you like. It's easy to zoom in on your waveforms and be like, "Oh God, none of these line up." But like that's not really how this works, guys. I wish it did, but it doesn't.
Exactly,
it would make it so much easier. But so don't sweat that. However, like I think we should talk a little bit about other instruments and phase as well, if you're up for it. So we can take what we've learned here and apply it to things like guitars. Like if you throw two mics on a guitar cab, you still have to worry about phase and polarity. Like in that situation, for me anyways, for starting out, I try and line those up like pretty well perfect. So if I have a 409 and a SM57, hopefully you guys know what those are, on a guitar cab, I'm going to try and get the diaphragms like perfectly lined up as a starting point. And then I'll flip the phase, and like my guitar tone should almost evaporate if I've lined them up really well, because they're going to be receiving the signal at the same time, and I've just flipped the polarity on one of the microphones that's essentially canceling it out, right? So I know that I've got them lined up at that point. I could record and zoom in and they would look like they're like lined up really well. And that's kind of my starting point. If you don't have that, you're going to start experiencing cancellation. I think there is with guitars. I wonder what your thoughts on this are, Benny. But there is sometimes when not having a lined up couple mics on a guitar amp with some cancellation does just result in cool EQ. But most of the time, lined up is way more solid to me.
Absolutely. And there's a little trick that I do when I record guitars to speed that process up, because there's some things you can do. You can just visually align the capsules. Like that's the first step, that you look at the microphones and try to get them as close as possible. Then you could maybe, some people do the headphone thing like in front of the amp, like you can run some signal through the cab, or just white noise or whatever that's coming out of the amp, and then you do turn up the headphones pretty loud and go in front of the cab, and then you move the mics and you flip the polarity on one of the mics, and then you move the mics against each other until you get maximum cancellation, and then you flip the polarity again and you have maximum like pressure. Yep. That's a neat trick, but it's kind of hard to do with noise, I think, and I don't know. It's always, it's something you can do, but I prefer the following trick. I have the guitar player, or myself if I'm recording. I set up the two mics visually as close as I can get them, and then I make very short, hard, transient, like attack sound, like with the pick on the highest string, just a click sound,
Yep.
And then I record that. And then I zoom in and look at the waveform, and I see that click in the waveform. And then I see, okay, this mic is a little closer than the other one because like you visually see the waveforms and which one is earlier and which one is later. And then I just move one of the mics back or forth, depending on which one I move. And then I do the click sound again until I see that those are completely lining up. And then I know that I have it. And it usually just takes one or two like small movements and then it's there.
Absolutely, yeah. I do the kind of the same thing, but I just unplug the guitar and plug it back in, recording that, and it gives a little pop, and I don't know, freaks out my clients because they're like, "Oh, you popped your amp." I'm like, "Yeah, they can handle it."
Exactly. Yeah,
like, you're gonna be playing through it at like max volume for hours. Yeah. It's gonna be fine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the same principle. Yeah, you can do that absolutely, and most of the time, at least with close mics, I will try and get them perfectly in phase, and I don't see a lot of situations where if you record yourself, especially where you would want to mess with that. You can always, like, if a mixer decides to make a creative decision and alter that, you can always like delay a mic or move that around
Shift
later.
it, yeah.
But for starters, like if you get those very, very lined up and on top of each other, I think there's nothing. There's not ever anything wrong with that.
Yeah, I know we talked about on an earlier episode, like just like for both of us when we started trusting the basics of recording and like kind of following through with these simple things that everything says, like every resource we've ever come across says to do, it results, like it just started working better. And then you can get creative. And this is like the prime example of that.
Yeah.
Get the phase right, make that like your first priority, recording anything, and then get creative. And you're going to be like set, your foundation will be laid.
Absolutely.
It's honestly like what sets a good engineer up from a bad one is just like how much they care about nailing phase, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And with guitars and bass, there's another funny thing that comes to mind.
Is it DIs?
Yeah, DIs. That and another thing, DIs absolutely, because like there is a time delay involved. If you record a DI, then it will not be. I mean, it's funny because you might want to think that the DI signal should arrive earlier at your interface or your converters than the mic signal, but in fact, I had times, and I don't know why that is, that the DI signal was late compared to the mic. But whatever it is, as always, like flip the polarity and zoom in and move the mic until it's lined up, or leave it as it is and move the DI signal later before you export it and send it to your mixing engineer. That you can also do that if you don't monitor them at the same time. You can get away with aligning them later, but yeah, the eyes have to be lined up with the microphones for sure. And what I was wanting to talk about is some guitar effects or bass effects, some preamps, some distortion pedals. They, for some reason, just flip the polarity without telling you. For example, the Sansamp, a very popular bass preamp and distortion. I don't know if it does it always, but in most scenarios that I've recorded a Sansamp together with the DI output of an amp or a microphone in front of the bass cap, I had to flip the polarity on one of those. Like the Sansamp, for some reason, just inverts the polarity. And
that's so frustrating.
Yeah, it doesn't tell you. It's not a switch or anything. It just does it. And there are some effects that do that. And same as with the kick drum, when it comes to the low end, it might not be to super low end. It might not be as obvious because it might, like, you might lose the important, like, I don't know, 100, 200 hertz area, but you might get a sub bass boost, or you might lose the sub and get a 100 boost or something, and both might sound okay on their own, and you just have to figure out what's the right one and what fits the song. But it's always worth checking polarity and phase there, and always don't assume that a piece of equipment has the same polarity coming out of it as you put into it. So
right. Yeah. I have one more, I don't know, maybe this shouldn't even be in this because this is like getting pretty advanced. But on that DI thing, I saw a great little trick where you record through an aux and you put a time delay on that aux and then print it onto a track as you're recording it. And so if your delay was late, you're delaying the amp signal or vice versa. And then it ends up printing in time and the edit's done for you.
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that makes sense.
We shouldn't put that in there, actually. I'm thinking about it. I'm like, that nobody's going to understand that at all.
I think we should leave that in, but I wonder how many people like can follow that. But
they're like, what?
Yeah.
Just nerded out.
Yeah. So, one more practical thing here before I forget about it with and it's back to drums again that I totally forgot when we were talking about the setup and what to do, what the first steps are that you should do when you are putting overheads in place and when you're positioning the overheads. Try and get the kick and the snare drum in the center of the stereo image between the overheads, because they are usually, when in the final mix and in the whole picture of the drum set, the kick and the snare should be in the center, because it's very distracting if you hear the kick or the snare from one of the sides, and then, like, it starts with the overheads. And the way you do that is you make sure that the distance from, if you have an A-B setup or a spaced pair, which means there's one overhead on one side of the drum kit and one above the other half, if you will, of the drum kit. And you make sure that the distance from each of those microphones to the snare drum and the kick drum is the same. And the way you do that is, I think the most important thing is the snare drum, but preferably snare and kick, because you might not always want to filter out the kick entirely, and there's always the attack of the kick that's still coming through. So in an ideal situation, you might want to have kick and snare centered. And the way you do it is you imagine a line through the center of the kick drum and the center of the snare drum. And this line is the center of your drum kit. It's like the center axis of your drum kit. And then you place the overheads in a 90-degree angle from that axis with the same distance to that axis. So you end up probably with one overhead somewhere between the hi-hat and the crash cymbal there on that side, and the other might end up somewhere above the floor tom. So not what many people do when you look at a drum kit and you stand in front of the kick drum, and you imagine left of the kick drum is left and right of the kick drum is right. That's actually gonna give you a weird stereo image, because then the snare drum will be on one side and the kick on the other.
Yeah.
And if you, I think I will put a little picture of this in the show notes, because then you immediately see what I'm talking about. But if you imagine this line through the kick and snare, and make sure that both mics have the same distance from the line in a 90-degree angle, then both kick and snare are have the same distance from the overheads and are centered. And that has to do with phase also, because if that is the case, then the snare and the kick sound arrives at the same time at both overheads, which means they are in phase, and you don't have to worry about that. You then have to make sure that the snare close mic is in phase with both of the overheads, but the overheads with each other are already in phase.
Yes.
Because the worst case scenario is if you don't do that, you might end up with the snare being in phase in the overheads and sounding great, but the kick drum might be canceling out, or vice versa. And then if you flip one of the polarity of one of the overhead mics, you get the opposite. Then the kick drum might be right and the snare drum might be wrong. So you have no chance to get it completely right. So yeah, gotta be careful of that, and I would definitely make sure that that's the case. It's easier if you have something like an XY or something like an overhead setup where the capsules are next to each other, and then it's not as much as an issue. But with a spaced pair, be careful.
Yeah, and just easy way to do that a lot of people don't think about is just grab a XLR cable and use that to measure.
Yeah,
find your access point, hold the cable there, and then just figure out the distance there, move it to the other one, and if you have a bunch of slack, you got to move that one mic, right?
And you'd basically do a triangle. Then you have kick and snare in one thing. You put the cable in the center of the snare drum and hold it with your hand, and then you hold it up against one of the microphones, and then from there, the rest of the cable goes down to the kick drum, and you hold it with the beater against the kick drum, and then you have kind of a triangle. and you move that whole
Mhm.
triangle over to the other mic,
Right.
and then you have both kick and snare with the same distance.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think that's pretty comprehensive for an intro to drum phase. What do you think?
I think so too. I think it's actually any more on that would just get exhausting.
Yeah.
I really hope you got an idea of the whole concept, and if this episode did one thing, I hope it is that you just are aware of it now and just experiment with it. Hit the polarity button every time you use more mics on the same source. Move mics around, listen for it, zoom into the waveform, just analyze and experiment on your own, and you will find out very quickly what this is all about. I think the most important part is that you are aware of it, and many of your issues can be solved with that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And let this also be like an encouragement to try recording with less mics in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
The less mics you put into the equation, the less phase problems you will encounter. Like 3 vocals or 3 mics on a vocal is a terrible idea in almost every situation, right?
Yeah.
So like, more is not better with microphones.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there should be a reason for every mic you put up.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Do experiment, but like I'm always throwing up a weird mic. Like at the studio I record in, there's literally a large tree trunk strapped to a wall, like this big, huge cedar root tree trunk, just like all a bunch of knots and roots and stuff. And I throw an SM57 in it, like every drum recording in a different spot, and do weird stuff to it. And like sometimes I use it, sometimes it's garbage, and I just mute it. But like, so I'm always experimenting. But like, I've gotten to a point where I'm quick at checking phase. I know what to listen for, kind of thing. So master the basics, like we keep saying.
Absolutely. And with drums especially, people tend to, if they have enough inputs, they tend to overdo it. I've gotten so many sessions to mix where I think people just focused on the wrong things. Like when I get a session and it has like 24 drum mics, but like it's obvious that they used old heads or didn't tune the drum kit right, or like none of the mics really sounded excellent, then I'm always like, if you had put the energy and time into tuning, putting on new drum heads and all that kind of stuff, it would have had a much bigger impact and would have made much more sense than trying to get all those microphones on there. That's just the wrong priorities. And also, if you think about it, how complicated it actually gets if you have more than like 8, 9, 10 microphones, because you start with the overheads against each other, then you add the snare to the overheads, and then you add the toms to the overheads. But again, the toms also might pick up some of the snare, and then you add hi-hat and ride, and they pick up toms and snare, and you flip it, and then the tom might sound right, but the snare is weird, and it goes on, and at some point you can flip whatever you want, and something's always off, and that's hard to do, and you need to be organized for that. You need to know what you're doing, and it can be overwhelming really quick, and it can completely like ruin the vibe of a session because something's always off, and like, so
it takes too long.
Takes too long, everything. Just keep it simple. And honestly, if you record a well-tuned kit in a decent room with a good drummer, that's the most important thing, and you just have 2 overheads, 1 kick, 1 snare, 2 toms or whatever mics, and you can't get that to sound right, I wouldn't start adding more microphones, because then the issue is something else. Like that should be possible with a small amount of mics, and you should always try and get that right first. And only then, if you feel that some part of the kit is underrepresented, like or not like loud enough, not clear enough, then you can add additional spot mics to feature it, but only after you made those couple of crucial mics work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm with you. A good drum recording is a good drummer in phase.
Absolutely. So true.
Done.
Absolutely. That's why there's mic techniques like the Glenn Johns method or Recorder Man. It's like too advanced now for this episode. We might get into it in another episode, but there are actual techniques to capture a whole kit with just like 3 mics. And there have been killer records made that way. Like if you know John Bonham, like Led Zeppelin drum sound, you can do that with very few microphones because
Yeah.
all you need, and I mean, all you need, quote unquote, it's a lot actually that you need because it's you need a killer drummer, a killer
John
room,
Bonham.
and a killer drum set. But if you have that, then you don't need like 24 mics.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another topic. But takeaway is use as little mics as possible. Check the polarity. Move mics around until you find the spot where you get the maximum like body pressure and impact, and you'll be fine.
Absolutely. Now go practice.
Yeah, go practice. Now, awesome. Let's wrap this up.
All right.
If you have questions about this, because I can see that this is a topic that might take a little while until you get it, and then you need to experiment a bit with it, and then once you understand it, it will be super easy. But if you have questions, or if we explain something in a weird way that you don't get, just let us know. Write an email at podcast@theselfrecordingband.com, and I will do my best and answer it. And we will do...
What do you think about a conversation on your Facebook group?
I was about to say, super awesome idea. Yes. After these episodes, I will try and do, especially the complicated ones, I will try and do a Q&A live session or something like that in the group where you can ask questions. And this will probably be one of those. Like, if you have questions, submit them through email or in the group or whatever, or just live when we're doing it, and then we will try to clarify everything that's not super clear right now.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I will, as I said, I will post a picture of like the drum center axis thing in the show notes, and I probably will. Yeah, I will do that. I will like dig into the archives and maybe find a kick track and a snare track mic'd with 2 microphones or something, and I put that in there, and I let you hear like one in phase and one with phase with polarity flipped, and then let you play around with this and hear the difference. I think that's super helpful.
Once you hear it, you can never unhear it.
Yeah, exactly. I will put something like that in the show notes. Not sure yet, but something like that will be there. Some downloadable WAV files and a graphic to look at. Yeah. Awesome.
Great.
Anything to add to that, Mark?
No. Just experiment, get used to hearing it, and check it every single time, and your recordings will be 90% better than everyone else.
Awesome. We're out. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Self-Recording Band podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you for sticking to the end through this very technical, nerdy kind of episode. If you've made it this far, you're probably interested in mic positionings. And we've talked a lot about positioning mics on stuff, on guitars and drums. And if you want to get a decent starting point for your next recording session, I have an actual mic placement cheat sheet on my website. You can go there, theselfrecordingband.com, and right on the homepage, there's a button that says download the cheat sheet or give me the cheat sheet or whatever. You will find it. And it is a PDF with great starting points for positioning mics on different sources, guitars, drums, vocals. So if you're not sure where to start, if you want to learn more about getting things up and running and move quickly and making intuitive decisions, then go there, download the mic placement cheat sheet. It's completely free. And let me know if you find this helpful. Thank you. See you next week.